What is up, everybody? So, today we are going to revisit the Secret Service car, Dave Powers and the Grassy Knoll, because what do you know? I made a mistake. So, for some reason, I had, since the early days of my research into this, which would have been like 5 years ago, I had the conclusion drawn that Dave Powers left the Secret Service car. And for some reason, it just stuck in there. And what do you know? He was in the Secret Service car. So I was wrong. So let's correct that error and see how that affects the overall outcome of the actions of the Secret Service car in relation to the Knoll shooter. So this is Altgen's photo number 7. This photograph has the 10 men who were in the Secret Service car and on the running boards as it pulled into Dealey Plaza. Now that I look at this, let me see, is everything correct? Yes, all the numbers are correct. Out of sight are Samuel Kinney and Emery Roberts. So, you have 10 men pull into Dealey Plaza on the Secret Service car. And now that we know Dave Powers remained in the vehicle, what we have is 9 people in the Secret Service car. And the 2 men who are of most concern here are John D., Jack Reedy, and Paul Landis. Paul Landis is still alive. And Paul Landis can be held accountable for what he did on that day. So this photograph was taken on the way to Dealey Plaza. You can see Reedy and Landis on the passenger running board. You can see these guys are basically the same height. This is from Altgen's photo number 1, I believe it is. You can tell they're the same height here, right? They're about 6 foot tall. They're Secret Service agents. They're big, tall, white guys. Paul Landis, and you can see it here, has a very rounded haircut. He has almost a receding hairline on this side and kind of a part that's, you can see in all 3 of these pictures here. Very distinct look. So Clint Hill will run to the president's limousine, leaving 9 men on the car. This is a photograph of Clint Hill on the back of the president's limousine. This is a very famous photograph. Clint Hill recently died. Now, the notes that are in the motorcade paperwork indicate as follows. The follow-up car, meaning the Secret Service car, has a mounted Secret Service radio tuned to Charlie frequency. All Secret Service agents armed with 38 revolvers. Hickey has AR-15 Colt 223 automatic rifle. S.A. Hill moves back and forth from the Secret Service car to the limousine, finally staying there following the shooting until arrival at Parkland. S.A. Bennett moves to the limousine on Main Street and returns to the follow-up car. During the shooting, S.A. Reedy runs toward the limousine but is called back by ASIC Roberts. So, the Zapruder film is not a good representation of what happened that day. It doesn't indicate that Clint Hill moved back and forth to the limousine and back to the Secret Service car. It just shows him running to the limousine. It definitely does not show Reedy running towards the limousine and being called back. That is excluded if it happened at all. Now we're going to read the statement of John D. Reedy. On Friday, November 22nd, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, I was working the U.S. Secret Service follow-up car about 25 to 30 feet to the rear of President and Mrs. Kennedy, Governor and Mrs. Connolly of Texas. At about 12:30 p.m., I heard what sounded like firecrackers going off from my post on the right front running board. The president's car slowed. Someone in the follow-up car stated he was shot, and I left to run to the president's car. At that time, I was recalled to the follow-up car and took the right front seat aside of ASIC Roberts and proceeded to hospital several miles distant. The shooting occurred as we were approaching the Thornton Freeway, traveling about 20 to 25 miles per hour in a slight incline. There appeared to be no spectators on the right side of the roadway. After the initial shot, I attempted to locate the area from where they had come from, but was not able to. It appears the shots came from my right rear side. John D. Reedy, Commission Exhibit 1024. So the most important thing to note here is that he says, at that time, I was recalled to the follow-up car and took the right front seat aside Aitzek Roberts. Okay, so this is in Dealey Plaza because he says he tried to run to the president's car and then run back. And from there, he says, at that time. So at that time is in Dealey Plaza. He entered the Secret Service car in Dealey Plaza. And I 100% agree with him. The problem is he didn't enter the front seat aside Aitzek Robert. And we can prove that because in McIntyre photo number 2, you have a clear shot of the Secret Service car, and the only two Secret Service agents are Samuel Kinney and Emery Roberts. That's it. Those are the only two people who are in the front seat. So Reedy's statement that he entered the front seat next to Aitzek Roberts is clearly false. Clearly false. And I'm sorry, I think I have the name switched here. It should be Emery Roberts on the left and Samuel Kinney on the right. Samuel Kinney was driving the car. But the point here is that Reedy lied. He didn't enter the front row of seats. If he entered the vehicle at all, he had to have entered the third row of seats, which makes him not visible in McIntyre photo number 2. We're going to assume for the purpose of this explanation that he did in fact enter the third row of seats. The alternative is when he stepped off of the car to run to the president's vehicle, he didn't step back onto the side whatsoever and remained in Dealey Plaza, because I can't find any statements in regards to Reedy and what he did after the shooting. So that needs further review. But for the sake of this explanation, we'll just assume that Reedy entered the third row of seats because we know he did not enter the second row of seats, and we'll get to that here momentarily. Now, Paul Landis. Paul Landis, I'm not going to read his whole statement. The guy wrote like 10 pages, whereas everyone else wrote like a page. So he doth protest too much, I have to say. I'll read this part. This is the most important part. The shooting happens, and then he says that he sees people around, and this leads to these following paragraphs. And he says, after we rode under the overpass, I again looked at the president's car and saw Special Agent Clint Hill lying across the trunk. He was looking back towards the follow-up car, shaking his head back and forth, and gave a thumbs down with his hand. Aitzek Roberts asked if anyone got the exact time of the shooting, and someone said about 12:30. Then someone told me to get inside the car and pulled me by the arm. My sunglasses fell off, and Special Agent Bennett handed them to me. By now we were on an expressway, and a few people were standing along the way, waving as we went by. So here's the problem. The problem is that Paul Landis is now claiming that he was still on the side of the Secret Service car throughout the journey under the underpass. So he's stating that he's on the underpass, he's moving under the underpass, he's standing on the running boards, and after they go under the underpass is when he's pulled by the arm and someone indicates for him to get in. He doesn't mention Reedy at all. He doesn't mention Reedy's location or whether Reedy got into the vehicle. But we have to assume that Reedy already did. In McIntyre photo number 1, when you zoom in, you can see that there's only one man on the passenger side running board of the Secret Service car. And that's because Reedy had most certainly either entered the car or exited into Dealey Plaza. And this man here on the side of the Secret Service car is no longer Landis. This man has a flat top. It's the same flat top we'll see on the zoom of McIntyre number 2. which indicates to me that Landis lied and that he entered the second row of seats in Dealey Plaza, which allowed for them to pick up this passenger in Dealey Plaza who stepped onto the side of the Secret Service car. So now you have Reedy in the back seat, presumably, Landis in the second row of seats. Now, how can we prove this? Because when you zoom in on McIntyre number 2, Paul Landis and his rounded haircut is clearly in the second row of seats here. When you look at the positioning of the men and where they're supposed to be, position number 3 is Ken O'Donnell, special assistant to the president. It is undisputed that he was in the second row of seats the entire trip. And now that I recognize Dave Powers was also in the vehicle, he's the man pressed up against the passenger side of the vehicle wearing the glasses. Okay? So those two men, it's undisputed, were in the second row of seats. But now we have a third man in the second row of seats between the two of them with his back leaning up against Kenny O'Donnell. And the rounded haircut is clearly visible of Paul Landis. So now you have 3 men in the second row, 3 men in the third row, 2 men in the front row, and then you have Jack Valenti and David Morales on the passenger running boards, putting the total men in the car at 11 if Reedy did in fact get into the Secret Service car. When you look again at McIntyre number 1, you can clearly see there's only one man on the side of the Secret Service car. And it is not Reedy, and it is not Landis. This man has a flat top. And then when you look at a zoom in of McIntyre number 2, now you have 2 men on the side of the Secret Service car. And remember, when we zoomed in on this, we saw that Reedy was in the second row of seats. Reedy was in the third row of seats, and Landis is in the second row of seats. So these 2 men are the extra passengers that they picked up. These 2 men being Jack Valenti and David Morales, the shooter on the Grassy Knoll, and his handler. When you look at the height difference, you can clearly see that the man on the front side, the front passenger side of the running board, is several inches shorter than the other man. But when you look back at Landis and Reedy, they're the same height. There's Landis with his rounded haircut and Reedy in front of him. Those are not the 2 men on the running board. The running board has, the tall man is David Morales, who was picked up in Dealey Plaza. And the short man, who's only 5'4" tall, is Jack Valenti, and he was picked up after the underpass. When you zoom in, you can clearly see that the man on the running board, the taller man, is nearly identical to the known photographs of David Morales. Mustache, flat top, everything. Probably the same glasses. When you look at a comparison between that man and Paul Landis, you can clearly see Paul Landis has the rounded haircut with the part and the receding hairline there. Morales does not. Let's look at the clearer modern picture of Morales. It's virtually identical. The hairline is virtually identical, and it comes forward. It's not receding like Paul Landis's. The man on the car has at least an inch on top of his head of flat top. Paul Landis did not. That's not Paul Landis. Putting these photographs directly next to each other and isolating them clearly shows that the man on the running board is not Paul Landis. And when you take all this into consideration and you add Dave Powers back into the mix, which was my mistake, you clearly have 10 visible men, and John Reedy is not one of them. Number 1 is Jack Valenti. 2 is David Morales. 3 is Emery Roberts. 4 is Samuel Kinney. 5 is Dave Powers. 6 is Paul Landis, wedged between Dave Powers and Kenneth O'Donnell, who's number 7. Number 8 in the third row, pushed up against the passenger side, is Glenn Bennett. The haircut is distinct. 9 is George Hickey in the back seat with the AR-15, and 10 on the running board is William McIntyre. And we cannot see John Reedy in this photograph. So he's either being concealed in the third row inadvertently by Bill McIntyre here, or he got off in Dealey Plaza, which needs further research. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. I just wanted to correct the record. You do this long enough, you're going to make mistakes. This is definitely not my first mistake. My first mistake, I publicly announced that Jean-Pierre Lafitte was the shooter on the Knoll, and it took me about 6 months of embarrassment before I realized I was wrong. Okay, so these things happen, and this is nothing more than correcting the record. But actually, when you put Powers in the car and you acknowledge he's the man with the glasses, it becomes clear that there were 3 men in that row. And this now has allowed me to positively identify all of these men, whereas before I wasn't sure who was who. So that's it for today, guys. I hope this clarifies things. And please, if you're interested in this type of work, come listen to my podcast, Corey Hughes' Bloody History. It's the most in-depth exploration of the Kennedy assassination ever. So thanks, guys. Till next time.